US Vice President JD Vance gave this speech on the failures of globalization recently. Let's hear what he had to say.
Now, that was the first conceit of globalization. I think the second is that cheap labor is fundamentally a crutch, and it's a crutch that inhibits innovation. I might even say that it's a drug that too many American firms got addicted to. Now, if you can make a product more cheaply, it's far too easy to do that rather than to innovate.
On the contrary, Mr. Vance, US capitalists did not simply see the chance to exploit cheaper labour overseas and therefore achieve higher profit rates. In fact, they were compelled to do this by the innovation that had already been achieved in the US. During and after World War II, the technical composition of capital rose exponentially. That is to say, the ratio of capital to labour of privately productive machinery to labour rose very significantly, meaning two things. Firstly, because exchange value is essentially labour time, the value producing part of that technical composition, labour, shrank. Secondly, the advance of this innovation meant more commodities were increasingly produced in less time, so that, to back up the first point, the average commodity produced less and less profit. This led to a worsening underproduction of value relative to the value of capital, which needed to be valorized, that is, it needed to be reproduced and expanded, and so inevitably arose an overaccumulation or surplus of capital that could not be invested or reinvested profitably. With the rising technical composition of capital, the value composition, the value of capital relative to the value of labour, also tends to rise, although it tends to rise more slowly than the technical composition. Because the rising technical composition devalues capital, there is, says Marx, a strict correlation. US capitalists were therefore compelled to export capital overseas, where the technical and value compositions of capital were lower. Now those compositions, especially in China, are also rising, and as Vance says earlier in his speech, Chinese enterprises are catching up with the US technically and scientifically.
I'd say that if you look in nearly every country from Canada to the UK that imported large amounts of cheap labor, you've seen productivity stagnate. I don't think that's not a total happenstance. I think that the connection is very direct.
Again, Vance has it the wrong way round. Higher immigration has not led to lower productivity. Lower productivity has led to higher immigration. The obvious way to boost productivity is to increase the labour supply, to have more hands on deck. So actually, the dependence on immigration has been a symptom of privatisation and the needs of capital accumulation. Of course, privatisation is also a symptom of the needs of capital accumulation, because as capital accumulation stagnates, one of the ways to counter that is through privatisation.
Now, one of the debates you hear on the minimum wage, for instance, is that increases in the minimum wage force firms to automate. So a higher wage at McDonald's means more kiosks. And whatever your views on the wisdom of the minimum wage, I'm not going to comment on that here. Companies innovating in the absence of cheap labor is a good thing. I think most of you are not worried about getting cheaper and cheaper labor. You're worried about innovating, about building new things, about the old formulation of technology is doing more with less. You guys are all trying to do more with less every single day. And so I'd ask my friends, both on the tech optimist side and on the populist side, not to see the failure of the logic of globalization as a failure of innovation. Indeed, I'd say that globalization's hunger for cheap labor is a problem precisely because it's been bad for innovation. Both our working people, our populists, and our innovators gathered here today have the same enemy. And the solution, I believe, is American innovation.
Vance is writing checks he can't cash. The idea that the US is going to bring back masses of industrial jobs is fanciful, not only because of the US's dependence on Chinese production, but because innovation increasingly involves automation and robotification. Because robots are falling in price, and they don't require spending on the hiring process or their holiday or maternal pay or even heating or lighting for their working environment. They don't need breaks, they can work in the dark 24/7, so they work out a lot cheaper in the long run. What prevents or slows down investments in robots and other innovations is overaccumulations of capital. The source of profit is being abolished. What the US needs is a publicly owned economy so that the profit necessity and surplus capital are not slowing down innovation, and so that the US population can have full employment and share out the burden of work while using automation to reduce the length of the working day.